Hello, hello.
What's going on, man?
Hey, how's it going, buddy?
So far, so good. They treating you okay?
Yeah, I'm doing okay.
Hey,
Um,
man, if you want a reliable laugh, you got to check out one of our long lost or long forgotten philosophers, man. Check out Macho Man Randy Savage, Cream of the Crop on YouTube.
okay.
Never fails.
Gotcha.
You want words to live by? You got to go with nothing means nothing means. It's
Okay. Um, oh, is that like one of his skits or?
Yeah, it's one of his most well-known promos. It's everything that we love and make fun of about pro wrestling is there. Golden. Absolutely golden.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, hey, we're talking about capitalism, right?
Yeah, so as far as that goes, I guess the easiest place to start is, where are we and how did we get here? And obviously much has been made, more recently about the plight of white families, in the Midwest and other rural areas around the country, and for good reason. A lot of the facing, are their condition is to be pitied in a number of ways. I think the difficulty a lot of people are having, though, is with the subsequent analysis and response to the condition.
Wait, hold on.
And
I'm sorry. This is gonna sound really dumb. Wait, are you
yeah,
black or white?
if you had to guess, what would you say?
I 100% black. I assumed you were black just because of the voice. Are
You
you?
are you are you are most definitely right.
Oh, okay, 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 gotcha. I thought you just said white families, and then I heard the word "are," so I wasn't sure if you were referring to that or not. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're together in this. I mean,
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I was
that's
just making
that's
sure I
that's just
wasn't
the
misunderstanding or would say something really stupid. Just
yeah,
making
man,
sure.
that's the simple truth. I mean,
Hmm.
we're not apart. But the problem, though, is when you listen to the response, from people who would call themselves conservatives, or even some liberals,
Hmm.
is the fact that we ran this experiment already,
The
and
democracy experiment or something different.
no, the economics experiment. So the question is, what happens to a population when they see economic prosperity as a possibility, and then ultimately they watch it evaporate, fade, and die? That's the question. And so when you see, luminaries like Tucker Carlson, looking at what's happening to these people, and they suddenly put their thinking caps on and they say, maybe, just maybe, the economics play an important factor in families remaining strong and in communities remaining strong and together. Maybe that's the case.
Hmm.
The problem with that is we already knew. I mean, if so, when I say we ran that particular experiment for 120 years, what I'm talking about is the period after emancipation through roughly 1980, yeah, about 1980, 1985. So after the emancipation, you know, the freed slaves were thrust out into the world and told, if you're going to make it, you're going to have to make it on your own.
Hmm.
And what they were able to accomplish in that period up through about the 1930s or so was really astonishing. You had people who were largely illiterate and completely ignorant to what was before them. You saw them succeed in ways that you wouldn't have assumed they could have succeeded.
Hmm.
And so up to about that point, you saw Jim Crow also enacted, and even in the face of that, in many ways, you saw black families still succeed to an extent.
Hmm.
But in the years after that, when you start going through the period at the end of the 40s through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you start to see some really detrimental policies enacted. I don't need to go through them. I'm sure we all know what they are. And then
Wait.
you
I'm
know
curious. What do you mean by that, real quick?
So, I mean, Jim Crow is obvious, and then you have things that are not so obvious. So, a lot of people are familiar with the New Deal, FDR,
Hmm.
a progressive luminary, if we're to take what we're given, as gospel.
Okay.
Well, the New Deal, by design, froze out a number of black people from those economic benefits that were given to others. I mean, that's not necessarily controversial or
Okay, okay.
mysterious.
I think
It's well documented.
Yeah, okay. The only reason I ask is because some of the, and I'm not saying you're this, but just to 100% be clear, some of the white nationalists that I argue with will say things like welfare is actually like a policy that has put black people behind because it incentivizes stupid black people to have a lot of kids, and that's why there are so many single households. I was just making sure you weren't going down that route. just so,
Sure, sure,
yeah,
and that's understandable.
yeah, okay, just to make sure. But
I
okay.
definitely think I take your point.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at this point, though, we ought to pause,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we ought to go to what I'm assuming is a familiar place. Do you watch Breaking Bad by chance?
I have seen it before, yeah.
Okay. There's an excellent scene between Hector Salamanca and Walter White,
Mm-hmm.
and Walter's complaining about the fact that he's had to make these choices, and Hector asks him, why did you make these choices? Why did you make these mistakes? And Walter says, well, I did it for my family. And Walter asks him a question that I think really cuts to the heart of a lot of the issues that we see, kind of across the board. So Hector, he asks him, well, what does a man do, Walter? A man provides.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you were to cut open the American ethos, at the heart of it, you would see that that phrase is really, that's the whole show. Men, by and large, they weigh whether or not they succeed and fail by whether or not they can provide for their families.
Sure.
And so in black families, and really, I mean, this is probably true for a lot of families who operated this way, not only in the past but now. Once those economic opportunities evaporated, and once they were no longer able to provide for their families, well, what would you assume happened in that situation? They never articulate it publicly, but they no longer see themselves as viable men. And so, all kinds of pathologies start to develop in that situation. They start to become self-destructive. They become abusive to their mates, to their children, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately they abandon the family in many cases. And, you have all the repercussions that come with that.
Okay.
So you fast forward to what we're seeing in many, white families that are in the similar position, and you see the exact same thing. You see a lot of men who are no longer able to support their families, and so they don't really see themselves as viable contributors in general. But what are the effects? Well, I mean, we see in many parts of the country, in many of them, these same impoverished areas where men are killing themselves at rates we've never seen before. Response, women who live in these areas, I mean, they may be sympathetic, but they aren't foolish. You can't marry someone who is not in a position to help with family responsibility. So they don't marry these men. And so you see higher and higher rates of, children being born out of wedlock, et cetera, et cetera. So while it's understandable that, people of the conservative stripe are now, deeply interested in these kinds of problems, it's difficult to take them at face value when we could have had a viable solution to this problem had we taken more seriously the issues we saw in not only the black community, but in other communities for many decades. And the response to that problem, I guess the two primary responses to that problem previously um, came from two camps, both reprehensible, but not equally reprehensible. So the I guess the quintessential conservative response was to peer over into these families and say, well, okay, your culture is fucked up. That's where these problems come from. Never once stopping to ask,
Where does the culture come from, right?
yeah, these simple, if you were halfway curious about, finding a solution or understanding the problem, well, how, why,
Yeah. This
let's
was,
start there.
I don't know if you heard it, but I had a conversation with a guy that his argument was that black people's problems were like 20% like other people and then like 80% culture or some shit. And like I asked him like, well, what's bad about black culture? He's like, well, in rap music, for instance, they don't trust the police a lot. And I'm like, okay, well, why don't black people trust the police? Like, yeah. And it basically all of it went back to shit like that. Yeah, it was kind of stupid, but.
Yeah, and so now finally that the problem is spreading such that you can't ignore it, suddenly we get curious and we start asking why. So better late than never, I guess you could say. But I think at this late date, you're not really going to find many viable answers that will work at scale. I think that's the toughest part to deal with. But I mean, as far as, and I hate using the word capitalism and other labels like that because I think they're largely useless. I think the best thing you can do when you're trying to evaluate, how to move forward is to just simply look at what actually has happened, describe it as thoroughly as you can, and then take the lessons from it, and take the lessons that are valuable and move forward.
Hmm.
So I mean, I'm of all the definitions I'm aware of, I don't think what we've had so far in this country can be defined as quote unquote capitalist. I mean, the United States government, i.e., the taxpayer, has been at the forefront of funding, much of the heavy lifting when it comes to innovation in this country. Uh, that's not to say that markets aren't important. I think markets are important and they're worth preserving. But what we really had is a symbiotic relationship between government on the one hand, seeking to, work through different problems. And then once the research is done, paid for by taxpayers, people who are, smart and who know how to operate businesses properly see opportunity and they repackage these solutions for a mass market. I don't think anybody would call that capitalism.
Mm, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I guess when I think of capitalism, I just think of like I guess like markets working the way that they do. But obviously, there's a lot of publicly funded stuff. Like there is no like true perfect like libertarian like ideal thing where everything is like privately done. I mean, there has to be some level of government intervention. So I would consider it like a form of capitalism. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I guess in the end, it becomes a kind of shorthand.
Sure.
Um, and when you think about these systems in the abstract, it's only people who are fans of that sport, I think, really care. I mean, when you look at how people live their lives and how they plan for the future, they try as hard as they can to deal with what's coming at them tomorrow and the next day afterwards. And so I think, because I think the difficulty that you have to work through is obviously at some point in the not too distant, large number of people are going to be in a situation where they won't have very much value to offer the market.
Yeah. Which is kind of what we're worried about and why we talk about like UBI and stuff so much, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so since that's the case, then you arrive at another question, and the question is, what is the story that you can tell so that you can justify this idea of universal basic income? Because it has to be something, I think, deeper than, well, people can't work, so we got to give them money. I think that kind of superficial answer is only going to get you so far, and I think you just have to go a lot. I think you have to go a lot further than that. And I think being honest about the nature of innovation in this country and being honest about how much taxpayers have invested in much of the tech and medical advancement that we've seen is probably a good place to start, because in any fair or rational situation, when you invest in something you expect some kind of return,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think that's probably the better place to start, as opposed to, well, people can't feed them.
Wait,
I
hold
think
on.
you have to be.
You cut off. You said people can't feed them, and then you got cut off.
Oh yeah, I think you have to be a little bit more sophisticated than people can't feed themselves, so they'll die. So we have to give them money. I think you
Sure.
need more than.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Yeah. So
unfortunately,
more that like a UBI is something that like the American public has earned via
yeah,
their
exactly.
contributions rather than yeah. Sure. Okay. Yeah. I
Yeah,
can.
because we, as a country, I mean, we've been groomed, to really, trying to say this as diplomatically as possible. Stories are important to us, or for better or for worse. So if you're going to, because UBI and that concept is going to be more and more important. So the more that you can capture people at the heart and mind, or really the heart level, the better off you'll be with respect to capturing the mind. I think that idea is something that people can, probably wrap their arms around and accept, as opposed to, well, because the other way, I mean, it kind of sounds like a chore. Well, we gotta help out the poor folks, or else they won't be able to do for themselves. I mean, that's
Yeah, and it's a lot more kind of dehumanizing too, I think.
yeah, man, and nobody wants to be seen that way. I mean, it's just it kind of debases everybody. That argument, I think, debases everybody it touches. So you got to go the other way. But the problem, though, is these ideas, they're not really ideas. I mean, what you're really talking about are just simple facts of history.
Hmm.
They're not, even though they're very easy to learn about, they're not universally known. So there's some hurdles you have to get over as far as that's concerned. But like I was saying before, I think that's the
That's the what?
place you have to start.
Oh, gotcha. Is basically teaching people that thing, or?
But yeah, I mean, I think as far as economic history with respect to the United States is concerned, that's the whole show. And it's interesting that it's not something that is discussed all that much. And the problem that you have is that we have these neat little buckets that we discuss things within. And so when you talk about economics, you get pushed into a capitalism versus socialism or communism conversation. And those conversations are usually a waste of time, and they don't really get to the heart of the problems that we're facing. So that's why I was saying before, outside of academic conversations, I think it's a waste of time to talk about these kinds of things in the abstract. Just let's talk about what's actually happened, and then try and move forward.
Sure.
So I'm curious about something. I don't mean to
Yeah.
to divert the conversation too far, but the other day after I finished up with some work, I was watching some of your older debates, and I gotta put the question to you that Jesus put to John the Baptizer.
Uh-oh.
What was it you were expecting to see when you were out in the wilderness? I mean, you are you are way out there on the like out past the reservation, out in the wild, talking to some of the craziest people I have ever heard in my life. What were you trying to do? What was it for?
2 or 3 years ago when I got into it, I think I have, just by virtue of kind of like what I've done in the past, I feel like I have like a pretty good head for understanding like how to like put together a good argument. I think that I'm pretty well equipped to do that, and I think I have a penchant for like explaining things to people. And so these two things kind of like naturally drew me to this area. And I noticed that when it came to online political conversations, a lot of the conversations seemed to be very worthless. The arguments tended to be very bad. The understanding of what was being talked about was very poor. So I guess I just kind of had this idea that I would become like a little bit more involved, and that it would kind of like, people would be having like, I guess like my goal would be, people would be having like better arguments, right? That I would get involved and be like, hey, like this argument sucks for this reason, like let's talk about this thing. And that was kind of my hope, I guess, initially. But now I guess it's more just I kind of just like to demonstrate how ill-equipped a lot of people are to have certain arguments, and then hopefully people can kind of like pick up on that, and it kind of influences whether or not people take what they say seriously.
Got you. Fair enough. Well, you have my respect, man. That's not something I would ever consider putting myself through. Um,
Yeah, I mean, like
'Cause-
you say that, and it sounds like on one hand, like I could present myself like very admirably. Like I think that these types of conversations are worth having, and even if I have to suffer through a lot of like mental excruciation, like I think it's worthwhile that it produces like a positive blah blah blah. But that's all bullshit. The reality of it is actually I really enjoy it. It's just really fun for me. I love people screaming at me and shouting at me. I like it when people call me a pedophile because they're out of arguments and they're really frustrated and they have nothing else to say. I like having 5 people in a call when none of them can say anything of like merit to me. Like that's all like incredibly enjoyable to me, and that's really that's like the big truth for why I personally pursue it. So it's not it's not like I appreciate the kind words, but it's not like I do it through some like big like altruistic drive. It's actually just really enjoyable for me.
no,
That's
no,
the
I
truth of it.
don't.
Yeah.
I don't doubt it. I mean, and if it's, well, I guess let me be clear.
Hmm.
The admiration comes from the fact that it takes a lot to be able to articulate ideas and be very clear about what you're trying to say when you're under fire.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely
And
something I've had to work out a lot.
yeah, man. And seeing you accomplish that, and throughout the course of these conversations was probably the most impressive thing.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously I don't know you, so I wouldn't know anything about your motivations, but seeing that is a rare thing. And so when I do come across it, it's like, wow, we got a real one here. I dig it.
Cool. Okay. Well, yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I think, I mean, because since I do what I do for work, I spend a lot of time just parsing through different kinds of media, and obviously in more ways than one, YouTube is the epicenter. But I think on, I guess, what we would call the left, there aren't. I mean, there might be a few, but by and large, when it comes to being able to articulate ideas that way, and to just be very clear and concise about things, there just aren't many people who can line up that way.
Yeah, a lot of
Um,
it turns into screaming matches or people saying that their ideas are so self-evident they shouldn't have to argue them. I noticed that a lot. That was another big motivation for getting on the into this as well, because I feel like most of like in terms of like progressives or lefts, like in the U.S., like those arguments are all like very heavily data driven that support the left. Like the right really don't really have very many like actual scientific fact to back up many of their arguments. For some reason, everybody seems to think they do. So yeah, that was another reason why I
well,
got heavily into
I
it.
I think that's a more recent development, because I mean, for several decades, there was a long tradition on the right of producing, formidable thinkers.
Hmm.
So you got people like Thomas Sowell, uh, you know, economists like Milton Friedman,
Hmm.
uh, even popularizers like William F. Buckley Jr., et cetera. I mean, these people, you might disagree with their analysis on some level, but you had to contend with their ideas, and you had better come prepared, or else you would get flatlined.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not a fan of Saul in the way that his research is cited whenever people use him. But there's a measurable difference between somebody like him and like Alex Jones.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess if you had to pinpoint the people who carry the mantle, I mean, I mean, Jesus Christ, there's no comparison between somebody like Soul or Buckley and the Ben Shapiro's of the world, et
Sure.
cetera, et cetera. I mean, these guys are basically they're infotainers. They're akin to professional wrestlers.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that conservatives don't really have that tradition anymore, because when they did, even though even Buckley admitted that they were wrong about pretty much every major idea during the period of the 60s and onward. Even though that's true, he was prepared to make arguments, and that's just not something that I've been able to come across so far from that camp, and it sucks, because I think in order to have a fully fleshed out idea, for how to move forward, you need to have at least two competing ideas that, it's just the whole iron sharpens iron thing, and right now it's kind of a one-sided conversation.
Yeah, I like the idea of even if I agree with one side, I feel like there needs to be a strong counter argument to keep both sides kind of honest with each other. Yeah.
And so I came across a guy by the name of what's his name, David Packman, not too
Yeah.
long ago.
Hmm.
For my money, present company excluded, he's probably the sharpest as far as
Yeah.
the YouTube side of things. He's a problem.
Yeah. I've
If
spoken to
if
him
you
before.
if
He
you
seems really cool.
Yeah, if you come to him either unprepared or talking out of your ass, he will flay you.
Hmm.
There's if you want a good laugh after you finish with the Macho Man promo, check out his conversation with Scott Adams about the border wall. It's everything that
Oh God.
it can
Scott
be.
Adams is another like insane, crazy dude. I feel so bad. Like I
Yeah,
think he's actually like legitimately like crazy. I feel bad for him.
I don't. I mean, obviously I don't know him, but he seems to be the kind of guy who he likes to be contrarian just for the sake of it.
I don't know about that. He has an insane obsession with Trump, and it's just very fucking weird. It's crazy.
That's
But
true. But if you read any of his books, I think you'd be surprised. Very lucid, logical, straightforward, and nothing that you would categorize as batshit crazy. I just think, when he starts to talk about anything political, then that contrarian kind of troll side of him comes out, and I just don't think he can control it.
hmm.
But yeah, that conversation with him and Pac-Man is worth
Okay,
high
I might look
comedy.
into that then. I'm kind of curious. So.
That aside, though, I mean, I think because because of politicians like AOC and Bernie Sanders, et cetera, you have a lot of people who are more open to fringe, well, not really fringe, but what socialist ideas and socialist, I guess, philosophy. The problem I've always had, though, with socialism as a concept within a market-driven economy is risk, because when you look at any kind of entrepreneurial activity, that's the central piece. 'Cause talk about labor exploitation, et cetera. But before the laborer enters the factory, it's already built. All the machines are all there, and that's because the person who invested has he's taken on considerable amounts of risk,
Hmm.
and the average person is just not. They're just
Capable of
not
doing it.
wired.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not capable, and it's just not in their DNA. So I've never really.
Wait, you cut off again. You've never really what? Uh-oh. Guys, where do I go to get blood oil? Fuck. Are you still here? Hello? I was in a blood kelp area before. I don't remember where it was though. Fucking titanium, dude. Oh shit, he got. Hello, hello? Fuck, right. He got killed by Liam Neeson. Jesus Christ, calm down, guys. I didn't cut any more table coral, did I? Bring him back? I think he's fixing his microphone. Hello, hello?
Yo, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now. What's up?
I think my computer had a seizure. I'm not 100% sure what happened.
Gotcha. Wow, I can hear you loud and clear now.
I forgot what we were talking about.
Oh,
Risk. That's what it was.
Yeah. Risk. People have factories, but because they risk it. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I mean, I don't know if you've heard any arguments that deal with that specifically, but I would love to hear, how that's addressed within that paradigm for sure.
Well, I mean, I'm a big capitalist, so I don't think there are any good arguments against it.
Okay. Fair. Well, okay. So let me ask you this then. I mean, obviously, there has always been a conflict between a market-driven economy and a democracy. I mean, it seems to me that that's obvious.
What do you mean by that?
So let's go back to the social contract. So you and I agree to terms, and we both agree that the only viable way for us to maintain those terms is to have what amounts to a referee, right? So you have a third party that we offload things like violence to,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, like the state.
Yeah, for sure. The problem, however, though, is the referee has dreams too. The referee, whether it be he or she, they want to, have a giant house and they want to, take their kids on vacation, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And so the stronger my position is in the market, if I'm a certain kind of person, the easier it is for me to say, hey, I can make all your dreams come true. I'll write a check. And then suddenly my position is now etched into law. And now I'm dominant over you. I think that's always been the conflict as far as I can see it. Do you not agree?
Are you talking about like people making big campaign contributions pretty much, or?
Well, not just that. That's obviously a good place to start. But I just think just in general, because capital is essentially power. The two cannot really be unlinked. So if that's the case, you're always going to have difficulties in a democracy where you want to give people as much of an equal voice as possible, but that's not really possible ultimately because of strengthened positions within the market, even though the market may certainly be necessary in some ways. It's just these are two things that aren't. It's like oil and water, and so you just have to manage the best you can, as far as I can see it.
Yeah, I understand.
So how would you solve the problem?
I mean, like dealing with I don't know. This is one of the hardest questions in the world because you're talking about talking about things like Citizens United. I don't know what the correct answer is, but it seems like right now we lean too far on the side where money has too much influence in politics, and that delinking these two things would probably be a good idea. But I don't know like where the exact balance is.
Got you.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bigger issue is what do you do once we've gotten to the point where large portions of the population just aren't worth all that much in the market?
Well, the ideal is that we are living in a post scarcity society, and that everybody can just pursue things that interest them, and that machines and everything are producing things for people, and it's good. I don't know what the reality is or what will happen, but
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in order for that to happen on any kind of realistic level, you're going to have to fundamentally change people's own self-perceptions.
mm-hmm.
I mean, this takes us back to Mr. Salamanca. What is a man? Well, in a world where, producing for my family is not part of my DNA, essentially, okay, so what is it that what am I here for? What am I to do? I think that's part of the reason why you have figures like Jordan Peterson, becoming more and more sought out, is because, on some level it may be superficial, but he is at least attempting to answer some of these questions, even though my own personal view is that he's kind of a snake oil salesman. But I don't think the fact that people are looking for figures like him should be taken lightly.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there is like a big lack in purpose and meaning right now, and that's where a lot of these people have come from, for sure.
And I mean, I'm not particularly religious at all, but I do understand the fact that if you are going to, because we're obviously as a country we're becoming less so, but if that's the case, you have to replace these rituals with something, because these rituals and these traditions are deeply embedded
Hmm.
in our collective DNA, and once they're stripped out, then you have, what we see in a lot of cases, people winding up feeling like they're cut off from the larger society. They become depressed, and all the things that come along with that. So I think before we get to a point where we live in this post scarcity world where we all are happy, whatever that means, given the person, I think you got to cover those particular steps first. And I don't really see anything right now that leads me to believe that we're starting that off. I think we're at a point where we're still not even really sure, how to deal with the problem, let alone actually deal with it.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. I don't know what the correct answer is there. That's obviously we both know it's a very, very, very complicated thing to deal with.
Yeah, and I guess the other component too is when you think about the economy in general. I mean, there's so many things we don't know. Like, for instance, how much of the economy is composed of people who are just essentially rent seekers. We have no idea. How many people are producing things that have not much, if any, intrinsic value at all.
Mm-hmm.
It may be a large portion. It may be relatively small, but I mean, we don't really. The only time we get a semi clear look into how big the problem might be is when there's a financial crisis, and we can trace it back to people who are propagating bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, we kind of just sail along, and we just hope things are. We hope it's like being on deck on a ship and hoping things down below are okay, and not not about to explode.
Sure. So well, I guess, like, what's your proposal? What do you think should be done differently?
Well, I mean, everything that I've thought of so far is so impractical that I think it's impossible. I mean, because you're talking about problems that are so fundamental that you would have to completely reshape the way that we, for instance, teach children. You would have to completely redefine how people see themselves and what their roles should be. I mean, that's a process that takes hundreds, if not thousands of years in many cases. So, I mean, I'm nobody's cynic, but just looking at it, it seems like the best thing you can do is just, keep patching up the ship and try and stop the thing from blowing up as best you can, and just keep moving that way. And you hope that you can keep things going long enough so that you can reach back and fix some of these more foundational issues. But the other issue is that you're facing people who are making substantial amounts of money based on how things are now, and they have a vested interest in
And
making sure
keeping
that you
things
don't
up.
change anything.
Yeah.
So you got that to deal with. So yeah, I mean, it's a mess. I mean, that's just the clearest way to talk about it. But I mean, it's some of the, but here's the truth though, as far as I can see, and it reminds me, I think, yeah, it's James Baldwin. He was talking to National Press Club somewhere in the 1980s, give or take.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he talked about is the fact that simplicity and simple-mindedness have basically, they've become American virtues. To the degree that you are sufficiently simple and straightforward, people are more inclined to rally around you and love everything about you, in spite of the fact that what they're really seeing is a kind of immaturity.
Yeah.
And so he was talking specifically about, Reagan, but we've seen that kind of pattern with a number of different politicians. And I think part of the problem that we have is the fact that culturally we don't deal with difficult problems all that well. We don't. It's not in our DNA to look at something and say, okay, this looks really shitty, but hey, let's sit down and actually figure this thing out. We're more inclined to say, well, hey, this like a good example of that is what's happening with this border situation. We know for a fact that when it comes to terrorist activity, we're much more vulnerable, with, due to people who are here on overstayed visas. All the professionals in the field, talk about that as the primary issue that you have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a hard problem to solve, in many ways. It's much easier to say, hey, there's a border down there. Looks pretty sparse. Let's throw some shit on it and see if it'll stop people from coming across, and maybe we can solve things that way. So there's just a natural tendency to say, hey, this one's simpler. I can, scream a little louder, given that particular fact, and then we can try something out along those lines. So I think, like I was saying before, you're dealing with deeply entrenched fundamental issues, and that's just in a lot of cases a situation where you just have to wait till it dies out.
Sure. Although I guess depending on who you are, I don't know if we can wait that long if you're talking about like issues like climate change and whatnot. But
well, yeah, climate change. I mean, I hadn't even thought about that, at least not within the context of this conversation. But I mean, if just looking at our tendencies historically, I see absolutely zero reason to believe that we'll do anything about climate change until it's, way past the point where we can do anything. I don't have any reason to think that that won't be the case.
Mm-hmm. Wait, what do you mean by that?
So, yeah, I worded that very poorly. I guess the better way to go about it would be to use an example. So we knew before we dropped those atomic bombs or nuclear bombs or whatever they actually were, that we knew what the destructive capabilities were, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least up to a certain point. But we did it anyway for a number of different reasons. I don't want to derail the conversation and going into detail, but it happened.
Okay.
And that's just one example. Typically what happens is when we're faced with an issue is we kick the can down the road, or you have a situation where somebody can profit in the short term because the status quo is what it is. And so they don't want anything to change. So you have those two things operating in the background so that the consequences, even though a solution might be obvious, or it might be, if it's not obvious, it might be workable. You don't work towards it for those two reasons. I don't think that was more clear, but hopefully that made a little bit more sense.
Sure. Yeah. People kick the can down the road. Yeah, definitely. Especially in our current system. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, and some of it just depends on the kind of person you are. If you can find things that that make you happy and that satisfy you in the short to midterm, I mean, that those are probably the things that people will just focus more and more on, and they'll probably just not pay as much attention to the fact that, yeah, there may be the apocalypse may be, coming over the horizon, but for now, I've got enough to eat and my family's happy. So when it does come, hey, at least I'll be happy when the whole thing blows up. That's a kind of solution, if you can call it that.
Mm-hmm.
But moving forward, I don't think there's much else to say or do.
Sure.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Well, damn. I mean, anything else or?
No, that was pretty much all I had. I think I was watching. I forget the channel now. I think it might have. Oh yeah, it was Bill Maher show, HBO.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching that a while back, and they had. It was kind of an old show, but he had Ben Shapiro on.
Yeah.
And I think the the sad, well, I don't know if you can call it sad, but I guess tragic might be a better word to use. But it's obvious that he's the kind of person that, if it were in his interest to actually be thoughtful and honest, he could, and he would be somebody that would be formidable. But he's obviously done the whatever internal calculations, whatever those happen to be, and he's decided it's much better. He's much better off, operating the way he does now. And I don't know. There's something about that because he's not the only person that does that. I mean, it's something that we've seen.
Yeah, lots of people, the Fox News types definitely engage in that type of behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just people at Fox News. You see it, with figures, MSNBC, CNN. You see it across the spectrum.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So I mean, that kind of thing just, it always kind of points me back to, the system that they all operate in. What is it about this thing that forces a certain kind of person to say, you know what, I could, provide value that would really move things in the right direction, but instead I'm going to focus on a different kind of value, and I'm going to to be as dishonest, divisive, and in some ways just ridiculous as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I can best accomplish whatever their goals happen to be. I mean, it's one thing if this were a problem that we saw with a handful of people, but you see this across the board. So I think it might have more to do with the arena they're operating in as opposed to themselves. I mean, I guess, I mean, I don't know much about the streaming world, but I assume it's probably very similar, where you can make a choice. You can try to be as outrageous as possible and attract people that way, or you can go a different direction. I don't know what the ratio is, but I assume it's probably similar.
Well, in the U.S., the media at least is for profit. I don't think Twitch streaming is necessarily the same, not yet. I mean, it's a different world, right? Not comparable necessarily to new stuff, but.
Gotcha. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. Well, good sir, I'm gonna go grab some dinner. It was good talking to you.
Yeah.
Keep up the fine fight, and hopefully at some point we can talk again.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll see you later, buddy.